Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Some of these issues, and the first one isn't immediately obvious that it's a campaign issue, and it's Facebook, right? Everyone's like going through, who had on their bingo card for September 2020 that the Facebook feed apocalypse would hit, right? That's the September 2020 apocalypse disasters. The Facebook feed went to this new feed. I'm not a fan of it. No one's a fan of it. It apparently is the ostensible reason they're doing this is they want to consolidate the UI so that mobile and desktop look more the same. I happen to spend most of my life on desktop and laptop, so I would much rather prefer to have my old feedback. But while these changes were coming out and everyone's kind of already paying attention, Facebook began alerting people that it would have an update to the user agreement. And this caught a lot of attention, and this is what I want to focus on. They announced that beginning in October, they said, we can also remove or restrict access to your content, services, or information if we determine that doing so is reasonably necessary to avoid or mitigate adverse legal or regulatory impacts on Facebook. And everyone's like, what? And some people start saying, Section 230. You hear Section 230 here, you hear it there, and people like, what's Section 230? What's going on? I thought Facebook was just screwing with their feed. Well, they're doing two things at once. The feed is the issue of the feed. That's UI, user interface. But when it comes to Section 230, there's been a lot of movement recently. This is a key regulation that basically underpins the internet as we know it and the way in which content providers like Facebook are able to protect themselves from civil lawsuits. And I've got a whole slew of links in the bottom. And there's a YouTube video that actually goes to Legal Eagle, which is one of my favorite channels. It has a nice history of the Communications Decency Act, which is where Section 230 lies in. When people say Section 230, they're referring to the Communications Decency Act, Section 230. And Legal Eagle has a really nice history of how that came to be. But at a high level, there's always been these First Amendment issues, even before the internet, of who has civil liability for the content in a publication, right? And Legal Eagle goes through a great history, but at a high level, in the 1950s, there's a Supreme Court case that was pretty key, that bookstore owners could not be civilly liable for the content of the books they sold. It was determined they could not reasonably read every book they sold. They couldn't edit every book they sold. They were in the business of selling books, so they could not be held liable for the content of the books they sold. And interestingly enough, it was a lesbian erotica fiction that was considered indecent, and they were trying to go out and shut down the bookstore because it had sold this. So always in free speech, it's usually an exploitation of the vulnerable by the powerful that prompts these cases. So leading to this, in the internet phase, this question came up of how do publications, what's the legal liability of a content provider? And it came into two approach. Some content providers were doing heavy moderation. They were moderating user comments, user posts. Others were doing no moderation. As Legal Eagle explains, early on in the case history, that meant that the courts would say, if you were doing moderation, you became legally liable for whatever anyone posted. And that created a perverse incentive to not moderate anything, because if I didn't moderate anything, I wouldn't be liable, but that creates a nasty experience. So the Communications Decency Act was it was a really, in my opinion, good law. Everyone hates it now, but it's easy to hate laws that actually work. And the reason it works, and what it did is it put in place that if content providers wanted to moderate their content, they would still not be liable for civil suits of the content that other people posted. Now, over the years, there's been a lot of myths that come up about this Section 230, and I want to go through a couple that Legal Eagle provided. One of the big things is this distinction between publisher and platform. You'll see people talk about, like, is Facebook a publisher, is Facebook a platform? Is the New York Times a platform because it hosts comments, or is it a publisher because it's writes stories? Legal Eagle points out that these are not binary. You can be multiple things at once. Websites are liable for the content they create. So if you're in the New York Times, you're liable for civil suit, defamation, libel, any sort of those violations for the stories you write. This came in the Washington Post with the stories they wrote about the National Mall confrontation earlier in the year, right? So, or last year. So websites are liable for what they create, but they're not liable for the content others create. And this distinction between publisher or platform is legal will use the analogy of hosts and author. If you're a host, authors can come and post on your feed, and the author is the one who created the content. One thing to keep in mind, authors are always liable for the content. Whoever posts that content is liable for it. Whoever creates that content is liable for it. I, as the infomullet, am liable for what I create. YouTube is the host, or in this case, Facebook. But when the video channels go up on YouTube, YouTube is the host. YouTube is not liable for the content I create, other than some things we'll go over. But hosts can also be authors. If Facebook wanted to write a column, if YouTube had weekly videos they produced, they would still be liable for those content for which they were authors. So a platform and a publisher is kind of a false distinction. It really matters the specific piece in question, who created it. Another myth is that Section 230 protects platforms from federal and state criminal prosecution. On federal, this is clearly not true. We're going to go over a case that later called Backpage, which was alleged to be sex trafficking and was the basis for a FOTSA law regulation that affects Section 230. But Backpage as a website was shut down under federal criminal law. And even while they were claiming immunity from civil lawsuits, federal criminal law still applied. It's a little bit less clear on the states. It's generally believed that it should be that state criminal law is applicable on these websites, but that's a little less clear. And we'll get into some of the reforms that are talking about it. Another key point is political viewpoint neutrality. Political viewpoint neutrality, people get this mixed up with net neutrality because it uses the same word, neutrality. Net neutrality is whether the carriers that distribute this on a pipeline, AT&T, Comcast, the cable providers, whether they can discriminate against types of content flowing. That's net neutrality. Political viewpoint neutrality is when a platform moderates content. Are they doing it in a politically viewpoint neutral way? They set objective standards and they moderate everyone the same. Now, political viewpoint neutrality is important if you're a public governmental function, because you have to be neutral. You cannot favor conservative over liberal or progressive over centrist. You can't favor this over that. You have to be politically viewpoint neutral. But private organizations do not have to be politically viewpoint neutral. This is a key part of First Amendment constitutional things, is that think of this, if the government said you have to provide viewpoint neutrality, in a way, it's controlling free speech. So that's never come across from the government standpoint that they had a right to do it. But this political viewpoint neutrality is now a major issue in Section 230. And the last thing is something called the Fairness Doctrine. Now, the Fairness Doctrine is a long-standing doctrine that ended in the 80s, which basically said if you are using a public broadcasting license, your public airwaves are owned by the government, they're auctioned off, so there's a limited number, and it inherently comes from the government. The Fairness Doctrine said if you got one of these licenses on radio or TV back when there was like 4 channels, or you're limited to the radio, you had to provide equal time to the two political viewpoints. This is different than political viewpoint neutrality and editing, because now we're talking volume of presentation. If you had 4 hours of content from liberals, you'd have to have 4 hours of content from conservatives. And that got done away with in the 80s. It's largely why we, conservative radio kind of blew up. It was able to, didn't have to do but I think the Fairness Doctrine, again, it's a version of what I see as a government interference in free speech. So all of this is background to what's going on. So the last thing is Section 230 does not have sizing requirements. We're talking about YouTube and Facebook and all that today in the campaign, but the language itself does not distinguish. If Section 230 is removed or altered without specific language, that affects me as well. It affects anyone who provides a blog, anyone who hosts content that allows other people to post comments. So it's really a large impact, but it's certainly going to hit Facebook, because Facebook, largest platform in the world, it hosts the most other people, putting content. And it's, it's almost exclusively this other people's content. So it's immune from civil lawsuits. It doesn't have to have viewpoint neutrality. It doesn't have to implement equal time. And this has been the cause that a lot of people have been when we talk about Section 230 reform, have been pushing for years now because of these mega platforms like YouTube, Google, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, those kind of things. Enter Trump. Suddenly, Trump. In May 28, 2020, the White House issued an executive order. For the context, the president had a tweet a couple days before that furthered this conspiracy nonsense about a murder involving some news media he didn't like and their participation. It's completely bogus. Twitter docked that tweet. It was one of the first times Twitter actually made an action to fact check, delete, remove a presidential tweet. 2 days later, the president issues an executive order. Very clear retaliation. It mentions Twitter. It's explicit in what's going on. It even references the incident. So what the executive order of the White House wants to do is it wants to narrow the definition of 230 to what it claims is the original purpose. And this is to mean that these platforms are only protected from immunity on obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable. Nice, clear terms, pretty vague. It threatens to remove federal spending. Any agency that spends money to Facebook or YouTube would have to pull that budget. They ask the FTC to review whether large social media platforms are an unfair competition, and they encourage the state attorney generals to get involved. So what is the impact of this executive order, right? So because the FTC is an independent federal agency, it works a little bit different than if the president ordered Health and Human Services or DOD or Department of Homeland Security. Those folks work for him directly. When the president issues an executive order on something like the FTC, that's a little different because it's an independent agency. First of all, the FCC has to issue new regulations for anything to happen with the current Section 230. So just because the White House has issued an executive order doesn't amount to hill of beans other than that budgeting piece. And the order of operations is the White House petitions the FCC, which it's done through that executive order. The FCC then, if it chooses to, will seek comments for 45 days. That period is going on now. The FCC is soliciting comments through September 17th, at which point they'll determine if they're going to act on the petition or ignore it. They might just ignore it and hope it goes away. If they act on it, they have to then go draft and adopt a formal notice of proposed rulemaking called an NPRM, and that begins a very lengthy process to draft and adopt the order. For those of you who remember all the discussion and hullabaloo about net neutrality, it was going through these same steps. And so there's a long path for that, but courts, which are the guardians of the First Amendment, have usually rejected interpretations of the Communications Decency Act. President Trump is not the first person to get irritated at what people in the press are saying to him, right? So they tend to ignore executive order and petitions as not being influential. You have to go through and change the regulation. And Trump has already been sued on First Amendment grounds. There's a link to this in the comments where he was sued basically that by clearly Twitter docked his tweet. He retaliated with an executive order. That act alone, this lawsuit says, is a violation on First Amendment grounds because it chills free speech of a private provider to say, we're going to not allow you to do whatever you want on our platform because you're the government, we're the individual. First Amendment comes to us, not to you. And it's interesting because this will come up later. The two Supreme Court cases that are referred to in that lawsuit, the very first two are 1964 New York Times versus Sullivan, which is a landmark defamation case. And the other one is, drumroll please, 2010 Citizens United. So now Citizens United, which has been a key point of discussion, and we're going to get to in this episode, has come onto the stage as a key defense against President Trump's action to interfere with Twitter and Facebook and other groups through this ruling. But none of this prevents Facebook from simply making a voluntary change to its agreements. And it looks like what they're doing is they are preparing for a Section 230 change. When they say that regulation and lawsuits are going to be, we're going to be more restrictive on it, they're basically preparing for the landscape to change underneath them and say that even regardless if this goes toward with the FCC or there's any other thing, we are preparing to be able to ban content or reduce the visibility of content if we feel it would put us in jeopardy with a Section 230 ruling. And this has pretty large impacts because there's no law yet, but Facebook as a private provider can decide to do this. And by the way, ask any questions. I don't know if people are asking questions and I'm just not seeing it. I'll try and refresh here. But here we go, refresh the coverage. Are there any questions so far? Because we're going to get into what's going on currently. Okay, no questions seen. Great. So why is Facebook running scared? The president's executive order, I don't think that's very likely to result in a change. You know, we'll see. Even if it changed, it would be months out in the future. But there's a lot, the president is not the first one to come after Section 230. There's been a lot of reform efforts, and I think, you know, this is something that's come up in the campaign. Again, it's a sleeper issue beneath all the violence and protests and pandemic and economy, but this is a key issue. And it shows some of the background and history. It's not just Republicans or Democrats, it's both. But the big thing that happened recently in the last few years is a passage of a law called FOTSA. And this was the one that I mentioned with Backpage. Backpage was a website that was providing classified ads. So it was a host, and other people were posting classified as authors. And there was allegations that it was involved in heavy sex trafficking, that those posts were basically facilitating illegal sex trafficking, human trafficking. And Backpage was avoiding civil liability because of the Section 230. So there's a phrase in law, bad cases make hard law. Congress passed a law basically targeting Backpage. Now, Backpage had already been shut down by the time Congress got around to passing the law. But they passed a law that basically narrowed the Section 230 immunity to not involve sex trafficking. That's been pretty much a disaster because the definition of sex trafficking is so vague, and in the hands of prosecutors, this has become a tool for zealous prosecutors to target independent professional sex workers. Like if they want to put up a website and screen clients and take control, they're getting targeted now with this law. So they're having to go back underground. There's concerns when you cross the border. There's been issues with Canada and the US, and legal sex workers crossing the border who are independent. They're not being coerced. It's not human trafficking, but that's been an issue. There's been a lot of platforms have preemptively simply stopped hosting any content. I think Tumblr, for example. So it's an example of how when you take a bad case and make a hard law, it can have unintended consequences. And now Congress, in their wisdom, is studying the issue to determine maybe FOTSA was too far, too much. And that's the problem with these laws, is if they aren't thought through very carefully, they can have a whole lot of thing. Yeah, Laura mentions Craigslist also got, so Tumblr, Craigslist, these are companies that were never targeted by the FBI as far as I know, but they voluntarily got rid of their entire personal section to avoid becoming a target. And that's the knock-on effect of some of these laws, is that companies can simply remove the content, and it's not going to come down to whether you're right or wrong in a case by case. They're just going to make a broadsword ruling. So the state attorney generals is 47. So here, let's go through some of these other reforms quickly. The state attorney generals is 47 states. They want to make sure that Section 230 make it clear that the immunity doesn't apply to state criminal law. I got it. I think that's okay. There may be a couple states that are playing loosey-goosey there, but for the most part, I think state criminal law should apply. Got it. There's some, just as it went to sex trafficking, some people have seen now child trafficking and child sexual exploitation as the next front in Section 230. So there's a bill called the Earn It Act, which is to get your Section 230 immunity, you have to agree to certain practices, which the scope is intended to limit the sexual exploitation of minors and content. But in that legislation is basically limitations on end-to-end encryption. So if you've looked in the news of Apple and the federal government, having these fights over encryption, the government is not happy with private platforms having encryption it can't crack. So that one seems as a backdoor way to bypass encryption protections for private users under the aegis of reducing, the sexual trafficking of minors or child exploitation. There's a raft of conservative proposals that are basically variations of this viewpoint neutrality and fairness. What they're trying to do is say you can only get Section 230 immunity if you get a certificate, or you demonstrate, you make a promise that you will be politically viewpoint neutral. You won't edit any content based on its political nature. Some of these have sizing requirements. Senator Hawley has one that it's only targeting those with over 30 million users in the US, 300 million users, or 1.5 billion. That would protect folks like me, but it would still hit most of Facebook. Well, it wouldn't protect me because I'm on Facebook, YouTube. You know, it would hit the major content providers. There's another one that tries to strip the use of behavioral advertising, prohibit it. It's, you know, they would basically strip the immunity if you did any sort of behavioral advertising. But a lot of these conservative ones, there's another one that allows, so another one has taken a little bit more market-based view and said platform providers can either provide unfettered free speech where they don't moderate any content at all, or have to advertise themselves as a safe space and let users pick ones they want. All of these are coming from the conservative side of the aisle, and they generally have to do with viewpoint neutrality and fairness doctrine type concepts. They believe that they are being unfairly targeted and their content being unfairly moderated by you know, these social media sites. Well, they're not the only ones. So the Department of Justice is looking to allow Section 230 to allow federal civil suits, not just federal criminal, but federal civil, which would allow federal agencies to sue these social media platforms. And if you think about what's going on right now with President Trump and Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with a federal agency making a civil suit on what is essentially a free speech platform. Criminal is different, right? Criminal has different standards. It has different things. There's an implied harm of forced theft or fraud, but civil suits, then enter the Democrats. See, everyone's getting upset about Trump jumping into Section 230 and what Facebook's doing, but this has been a liberal, if not progressive cause for a long time. And in fact, you saw during the campaign, a lot of the more progressive candidates were coming out with very strident language about Section 230. So where the conservatives, they want to see, they're using the terms, they want to see political viewpoint neutrality and sort of equal time, and they're using sex trafficking, child trafficking. Those are the righteous causes they're doing. On the left, they are using the causes of violence, intimidation, hate speech, defamation. So they're saying, well, there's hate speech, and the platforms need to get more involved in hate speech, and if they're not more involved in hate speech, then they shouldn't have this immunity from civil. Beto O'Rourke said that he would any company that didn't curate content that incited or engaged in violence, intimidation, harassment, threats, or defamation would lose immunity. That would be a big change. Biden himself in a New York Times said that he thought Section 230 should just be revoked. I don't know if he planned to replace it with something, but just revoked. There's a bipartisan bill in June that said if a court ordered something to be removed and it wasn't done in 24 hours, they would lose Section 230 immunity. They would also remove immunity from federal or state, the civil lawsuits. Again, when politicians from both sides want to get involved on these types of issues, I get really nervous because both of them sort of have this, their standpoint is we're the aggrieved victim here. On the right, they both have their cause, which you can't argue with. You know, no one wants sex trafficking, illegal sex trafficking, exploitation of minors. No one wants hate speech. But the way you get about that, to have the government have the ability to allow these lawsuits to continue, isn't going to react the way I think people think it will. You know, Trump, the example Legal Eagle gives is Trump. If Trump removes Section 230 immunity from Twitter, the first thing Twitter is going to do is ban Trump. If I'm civilly liable for what President Trump says, President Trump is no longer on my platform. I don't care if he becomes the God King Emperor of Dune. He is not on my platform because the civil liability is too much. And this goes for all sorts of content. They would begin removing this. And I think the real risk here is that, just like with FOTSA, the unintended consequences get very high. Everyone who's advocating for these reforms thinks, well, I'm going to target violent and harassing speech, or I'm going to target illegal sex works. But they're imagining a case with somebody thoughtfully reviewing it and deciding and making judgments. That's not how this works. If I'm a social media platform, I set my algorithm and I just ban all content. So if you're publishing erotica, or you're doing anything related to sexual activity, or even scantily clad Instagram photos, but you're getting the likes and the views because you're an influencer, maybe Facebook suppresses your feed. I talk about violence and instability all the time. If Facebook's algorithm is just, well, we don't want to deal with anything coming to violence and instability, I could get Infomullet removed from Facebook, not because I'm promoting violence and instability. They just don't want to see anything to do with it. And what this happens is this is how government creates a chilling effect on free speech. It goes in and threatens. Remember, none of these laws have passed, but already private companies are beginning to react and warn. Now, I'm not going to say it's an apocalypse or this is the end of free speech as we know it, because that's always hyperbole and overwrought. But it is a concern that we see now Facebook as the leading social platform basically alerting its users, hey, we might be going down this road, and we give ourselves the right to, and we all knew this was a fundamental part of Facebook anyways, but there was kind of an implicit agreement that you would have a range of viewpoints. And Joe has asked, let's go to some questions. The government has done a terrible job of understanding Jerry Spalding, yes, our Jerry Spalding, Infomullet data science militia team member. The government has done a terrible job of understanding tech and the fallout of their laws on it, especially the FCC and net neutrality. Yeah, this has been something that's been going on for years now, and it was really net neutrality was the focus in 2017. Now it's shifted to Section 230 and the content. So in some ways, what people were concerned about with net neutrality, and I don't want to get deep into that argument because that may be another episode entirely, but they were worried about at the carrier level discriminating between kinds of platforms, video versus static website versus something else, and creating a chilling effect on how users reach their content. Section 230 is to the jugular on that. If net neutrality is an attack on the body, Section 230 is an attack on the jugular, because now you're talking explicitly about content and the threat of civil lawsuit of any provider. Remember, Section 230 does not have sizing guides. I, as a internet provider of some repute and note, best known in Sweden and Turkey, would be liable under, if Section 230 is removed. All these comments that are going on right now and thing, I guess I'd be liable. And if the herpes guy shows up and sells a herpes cure and it doesn't work and you bought it while I was broadcasting my AMA video because I couldn't block him, maybe I'm responsible for your sustained herpes outbreak. I mean, these are things I don't want to have to think about. Joe Hogan's asked, are politicians avoiding assessing this out of fear of seeming soft or sympathy with sex traffickers? See a QAnon. Joe, excellent point. Thank you for bringing this up. I don't know. You know, I talked about there's the two ways that the left and the right are positioning this. Whenever you want to position a bad law, you've got to have a moral. We talked about moral panics, right? Last time. A moral panic is when your values are under attack and you kind of have this social contagion that society itself is under threat. If you want to have a bad law passed, you really want to have a moral panic associated with it. And on the right, the moral panic is sex trafficking, exploitation of minors through sexual use, illegal use of that. That's their moral panic they're driving. On the left, it's violence, it's hate speech, it's violent groups and violent contact. I don't want to diminish either of those issues. But I think when you think about the context, when you come to a policy decision with something like the First Amendment, you're constantly doing trade-off analysis and looking at alternatives. And the question is it, it's just like, let's take terrorism and security, right? Is it worth, to avoid the deaths that we have from terrorism, is it worth no longer living in a free society or having our freedoms curtailed? That is a question we grappled with for years during the War on Terror. That's no different than saying, to what extent is it important for us to stop and limit sexual exploitation of minors and illegal sex trafficking or human trafficking? Well, that's important, but do we want to do it through our First Amendment, or are there alternative means which might be better suited, better tailored, more effective than just taking this hammer to the First Amendment? And that's generally where I fall down. I don't like using the amendments to solve criminal problems that are themselves the long tail of a distribution. 99.999% of the material on the internet is not violent hate speech inciting people to go out and kill, or at least in the US, other countries are a different question, or the sexual exploitation of minors. But when we make these laws with those kind of moral panics, and the QAnon conspiracy, I think to Joe's point, is prime for this, we risk the perception that, well, this law is only going to affect that, but it's going to have a much wider impact on the rest of us. John, let's see. John, okay, so now I've got a second question on QAnon. Oh, it's the same one. Do you see the QAnon construction of sexual exploitation as being one of the influential factors in the sudden interest in the topic and the loud policy announcement? Okay, different. John's asking, so Joe Hogan was asking, do I see QAnon as being their emphasis of sexual exploitation of minors being the banner? Yes, I see that going hand in hand with a lot of these reforms. John's asking, do I see that as why this sudden policy announcement and executive order? No. I see when you read the White House executive order, it's linked in the files. It came out days after Trump got dinged on Twitter. And it is written very explicitly to go back at Twitter. And it doesn't really mention, I don't think it mentions, I mean, it has some token references in there to this kind of stuff, but it's much more about political speech than it is about exploitation and trafficking. And it's much more, it has the read and feel of kind of like a retaliatory letter. So I think the White House executive order was entirely spurred by this president getting dinged on Twitter. And if you listen to him and how he speaks, he takes personal grievance whenever the media doesn't portray him well, and he doesn't see the First Amendment as protecting media sources that disagree with him. This is really concerning. He views that he is above the First Amendment. Whenever you listen to him, he goes, well, the First Amendment's good, but how could they write the story when we're doing so well on COVID? They're just lying, and the First Amendment shouldn't protect that. That's a dangerous position for a president to have. Jerry is asking, if you want to know what the encryption regulations will do to online commerce, look at what happened with TSA keys. For those of you who know what TSA keys, that statement makes sense. I don't. So I assume it was bad, but Jerry can clarify in the comments and I'll get back to it. So John is referring to a past when moral panic about sex trafficking seems to be more and more mixed into Kabbalistic conspiracy theory that relate to old school anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have been around for years. That's a good point. Conspiracy theories tend to, remember, a good explanatory theory has few anomalies, and an anomaly is something that requires another theory to explain it. One reason conspiracy theories tend to accumulate complexity and then sweep in these old things is because they need to have more and more reasons to explain what's going on. And eventually, whenever you get into these theories that end up becoming world-spanning, global universalist conspiracy theories, that almost always trips over an anti-Semitic conspiracy that the Jews are behind it all, blood libel, things like that. That's been around for a long time. You'll see it. Jerry is saying your luggage likely has TSA locks that can be opened by one or set. Oh, he's talking about TSA locks that are on luggage. I thought you were talking about some high-end encryption or something. So Jerry's confirming that the TSA locks are actually physical locks that can be opened by TSA keys. They were supposedly protected and limited just to the TSA until one was shown on TV, and then you could buy it online the next day or 3D print with your own hours. Now you can get them anywhere. Yeah, that's a good example. When it comes to encryption, you don't want the government holding the keys on this. They tend to be sloppy with it. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the Info Mullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the Info Mullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.